Can everyone hear me? Even those of you sleeping in the back? All right, you're awake. Firstly, thanks for the patience. I know it's been a long day and we're only halfway through it according to the agenda. So I really appreciate you guys turning out. I'm going to try and rip through these slides because we've got a shortened time frame allotted to each of the presenters. So let me tell you what I want to cover. So my topic is really, if you're building a social game or in the process of designing one or thinking about building one or actually growing one, how do you leverage community successfully? Why is community important? And why it's something you can actually measure and see measurable positive and negative impacts if you do well or not so well. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'm going to cover 4 broad topics in this talk. I'm going to start with an overview of Zynga, a little bit about sort of our mission, why we still feel there's tremendous opportunity still to conquer. Then I'm going to start at a very macro level at sort of a 50,000 foot view and talk about what community means in the context of a social game, to the big picture, why you should care about it. Then we'll go one level deeper and sort of look at best practices or models of engaging community. And I've sort of bucketed them into 3 different areas. The first one really is just basic communication. It's how to have a conversation with your community. And it seems obvious, but there's a ton of different tools and social media channels, and it gets confusing and bewildering. And each of them has advantages and disadvantages. Then we'll go to a more meaningful connection with your community, which is you go beyond a conversation where you post announcements on your blog or a fan blast to your Facebook page or a Twitter tweet, and talk about how you partner with your community to co-develop your game, to improve it, to take the voice of the community seriously, and actually make that sort of a positive feedback loop. And each of these cases, I'll give you specific examples from some of our games. And then finally, sort of talk a little bit of sort of adaptation where the game design and the roadmap gets influenced by what's happening in the community and by sort of careful observation and engagement with the community as this change is unfolding in your community, how you can very profitably sort of learn, adapt your roadmap, and actually monetize or drive greater revenue and engagement through that change that you observe. I'll end and bring this all together with a case study of how community was used prior to launch, during soft launch, and post-launch of one of our most recent blockbusters, Farmville 2, and sort of walk you through this and then take questions depending on time. Okay, so a quick overview of sort of Zynga and so our mission and our vision. So very simply, we think there are a number of fundamental activities people do and will do on the internet and online today and in the future. And we want to be synonymous with play for people, just as Google is synonymous with search, Facebook is synonymous with sharing, Amazon synonymous with shopping. We believe we have the opportunity to be synonymous with play. Now, that's a pretty lofty goal, but then it was equally lofty when Google said they wanted to organize the world's information. We're a 5-year-old company, we're pretty young, and we think we've got a tremendous sort of growth path in front of us to achieve that. Let's talk a bit about sort of a little bit about us and sort of how we hope to go about it. How many of you have played at least one of our games? Show of hands. Not everyone. All right, hopefully we can convert you by the end of this talk. How many of you played more than one of our games? All right, great to hear. So these are some of our games. You might recognize some of the titles. Farmville 2 is actually our second newest as of today morning, because we just launched Cityville 2. And we continue to sort of look at different categories and continuously expand our portfolio. So what's very simply, sort of you take that sort of vision, which is connecting the world through games and sort of being the platform for play. What does that really translate into at a high level for us? What that means is we want to be available to our players, to consumers, wherever they are, whenever they want to play. If those of you attended Trip Hawkins' fantastic keynote a little while ago, talks about the shift to sort of casual gaming, snacking, if you will, and we want to be there. We're on Android, we're on iOS, we're on Facebook, we're on Google+. We are looking at new platforms and devices coming out continuously. And our goal really is to sort of be that play dial tone, if you will. Wherever you want a little bit of entertainment, wherever you want to sort of compete with your friends, play with them, you can do that. To achieve this, we've launched a number of titles in a number of categories. As you said, most of you have played one or more of our games. We, in the first 4 years of sort of Zynga's existence, we managed to sort of really ride the Facebook wave dramatically, and so a lot of our sort of very popular and large titles still dominate from that platform. But we look at new platforms like mobile, we look at new categories like casual, arcade, real money gaming, and we see tremendous growth still in front of us. And finally, and this is really important, one of the things I think that Zynga drove in the industry as a change and sort of helped create the social gaming space was recognizing that gaming is not a niche activity. It's not, sort of nerdy, teenage boys in their basement sort of shooting each other. But it's a mass market activity. Increasingly, the demographics vary from young to middle-aged to old. And people engage with our games for very different reasons. To express their creativity, to get entertained, to connect with their friends across the world. And we want to be that platform by which people connect, by which people play, by which people express their creativity. So let me tell you a little bit about Zynga India. You may not be aware, we have actually a very large office in India out of Bangalore. I'm the general manager of studios there, and I help run some part of the studios. It's a pretty large operation. These are some of our folks at work and at play. But the thing that I want to sort of emphasize is we've not even been in existence as Zynga India for 3 years. We're 400 plus people and we're growing. We're recruiting across pretty much every function you can imagine. We operate global titles out of Zynga India. We run Mafia Wars, Hidden Chronicles, Cafe World, Empires and Allies, and a whole bunch of other titles. We have a full mobile studio. We actually are driving a lot of the mobile stuff that you see coming out of Zynga today and in the future. And equally importantly, and something I'm very proud about personally, is we have driven innovation out of Zynga India that has global impact across Zynga. One simple example of this just recently is we pioneered the use of subscriptions in our games and demonstrated how to effectively monetize and retain our most valuable players and payers using subscriptions. And this has now become part of our overall global playbook. So Zynga India actually is a tremendous office, and very proud to be associated with that. With that, let me sort of move on to the second part of the talk and talk a little bit about sort of the topic at hand. So what does community mean? So let's start at a very macro level, and this is in the context of sort of how we at Zynga view the community across our network. So at a very high level, Zynga currently serves a player community of about 311 million monthly active users. That's around the size of the population of the United States today. Or pretty close. I don't know what the latest numbers are. Now, this is at a tremendous scale. Zynga is sort of, in terms of social gaming community, by far larger than most other gamers. Game developers. But these are our audience. These are our customers, and we have to keep them happy, or they'll go somewhere else. Again, in this world of casual social snacking, you cannot count on your customers to be around if you don't entertain them, engage them, provide real value to them on a continuous basis. That's a lot of customers. Of those, 60 million of them come back every day across our network and play one and more of our games. 60 million daily active users. Across 175 countries, territories, statelets. So that's a veritable United Nations. And across a number of languages of which we provide our content in at least 19 of them, with additional coming. So that's massive scale for any community. And obviously, as you might expect, it's not a homogeneous bunch of users or players. Each game has their own community quirks. Each game has their own sort of rhythm. But what we try to do is sort of create best practices, learn from each other across our network of games and players, and sort of put that back into our games sort of to improve the engagement. So going down sort of one level beyond those big numbers. So let's say you're the general manager of a large social game, a live game like a Hidden Chronicles, a Mafia Wars. What do you think about on a day-to-day basis to drive your business forward, to keep that game fresh? As an example, Mafia was one of our oldest sort of beloved titles. It's over 3 years old and still has a very hardcore community. Same with games like Cafe. On the other hand, Hidden Chronicles, Empires and Allies are incredibly young games. So you've got the spectrum of games, spectrum of players. How do you keep them engaged? So if you're sort of running and operating one of these games, you think about 4 big things. The first, obviously, is the game has to be fun and engaging and interesting, which means the mechanics, the features, the storyline, the content that you put in continuously has to keep entertaining and engaging. Some games, it's a little bit different. For example, a PvP game where you have people competing with each other like Mafia Wars or fighting is a little bit different from, say, a standard game like Farmville where you have to continuously pump in new content, sort of the content treadmill that Trip Hawkins talked about for social games. But in either case, you have to, this is like a television show that's continuously running. It's 24/7, it's global, and has to be on all the time, and has to be continuously fresh if you want your players to keep coming back the next day and the next. Okay, so let's say you get that. That's just sort of table stakes. Second thing, if you want to make money, is you have to start figuring out how to manage that virtual economy. So Zynga pioneered sort of a lot of the social gaming monetization on Facebook and beyond. And one of the things, the way sort of most social games monetize is a small fraction of your players will pay you money. Now they pay money to buy virtual currency in your game, and that virtual currency is then used to buy power-ups, energy, stamina for fighting, for example, or virtual goods like a cute tractor on Farmville or something else. But if you don't manage that economy well, you will inflate it, and that economy has no value. So managing the economy is equally important if you want to stay alive as a viable business. Then the game has to stay up. We're a live service. All our games are available 24/7. So if Hurricane Sandy hits the East Coast and we have data centers there, we've got to figure out a backup plan. If Amazon goes down, we've got to have a backup plan. Because believe me, within seconds of that happening, all our message boards, our Twitter handles light up. Our players know the game is down. And you'd be surprised. I mean, they're the best early warning system we have. I mean, the moment there's a glitch in any of our live games, we know. Because our players we see spikes in our incoming CS ticket volume. How do you pull this all together? The fourth piece of this puzzle to actually operate and run a live game successfully is community. And I'm going to drill down the rest of the talk about sort of how we leverage community profitably as well as strategically to operate a successful social gaming business. This is good business stuff, guys. You know, it sounds like a squishy topic, but it's something we measure and something that we actively involved in. If this feedback loop is broken, you either don't have an engaging game, or you don't have a business, or you have a game but there's no players. So you have to keep that loop going, and you have to tend to all 4 parts of that loop. For the rest of the talk, we're going to focus on the community part. Okay. By the way, I can't see my countdown clock, so I have no idea how much time I have left. So I'm just going to keep going till you kick me off the stage. All right, so let's before we dig really deep into, oh, it's back on. Okay, excellent. Before we dig deep into this, again, let's look at the high level, sort of at a macro level, sort of how do we think about interacting with our community of players, right? And this applies to any game title, whether it's a Zynga title, or it's a title you're in the process of building, or it's a game you play. So it really sort of, if you break it by the direction of communication, right? The first one obviously is inbound. Something's wrong with your game, or you released a new feature, or your payment system went down. You hear about it, right? So we obviously have a pretty extensive CRM operation. We have customer support for our games on email, chat, phone, web, all kinds of different touch points where people can tell us if there's something wrong. People come to us, for example, if their game froze, or they lost progress in the middle of a quest, or they were in the middle of making a payment and something happened. And This is sort of a standard input, but because of the scale that we operate, we do put in place our own processes to escalate these to the studio. And as a GM, I can tell you personally, running some of our big games from India, I am on a lot of those escalations. We take it very seriously. As I said, it's part of the way I view the business to make sure that the studio attends to serious customer complaints. Or if there's a spike, we want to make sure we get out in front of it because there was an outage, for example, in New Jersey, and let our customers know that don't worry, we're working on it, we'll be back up. So this is your inbound queue, and typically it spikes when you release something that's maybe complex or hard to get through, or your payment system's down, or your game is down. Then there's the outbound communication. So in this primarily, keep in mind, both of these are conversations, but it's primarily the direction of communication that's the prevalent one that I sort of classify this in, where each game studio has its own dedicated player advocacy community team and CS folks who are very tightly tied to the game, the roadmap, and the studio. And so when we are in the process of releasing new stuff or making announcements or sort of, maybe creating a teaser campaign for something that's coming down the road, we reach out to our community. We engage them through our fan pages on Facebook, through our Twitter handles, through blogs. We create contests, trivia, etc., to start generating excitement even prior to launching something. And again, I'll explain sort of how this works in the context of some of our games a little bit further down the road. Finally, the most interesting one is sort of the bi-directional collaboration, and I'll go into examples of this later on. So 2 examples here basically where one of the things that we learned with some of our games is we've got very, very passionate players. They care deeply about the future of our games, about the roadmap. If they think we are not staying true to the spirit of the game as we add new features, and they're not shy. So they let us know. And they create campaigns on Facebook. They send email directly to Mark Pincus, which sometimes does get attention. And basically, what we realize in a lot of these games is we'd like to partner with some of these folks who've invested so much of their time, in some cases money, in some cases hours of gameplay, created friends through our network of games, and see how we can take their point of view in a way that's constructive, instead of just being reactive. And so we'll talk about 2 such models. One is something we call the PAC, which is the Player Advisory Council, which has now become a best practice for all our games. Again, something that we revived and pioneered out of Zynga, India just last year. And we'll talk about both the benefits and the risks of doing this, because of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There are risks, but there are huge benefits if you do it well. And you get rewarded by your players, which is the most important thing. If they see you're genuinely listening to them, and they understand that there are certain things that, if reasonable, we will try to make sure gets in the game or fix, they're a lot better advocates for you in the community because they understand your point of view instead of just being a faceless corporation. Also, something that we found works incredibly well in a lot of our games is sort of players' community, contributing to the content in the game itself. Sort of user-generated content that gets surfaced in the game, players get recognized, and we'll take a few examples through the rest of the presentation to actually show some really funny stuff. But it's something that is not just a way to sort of keep players engaged and loyal to your game. There's good business sense behind this, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So these are 3 sort of broad models of interaction I see sort of as I run large games with sort of my community. And the question then is, of course, what tools do I use? I could drown in the number of channels I can use to talk to them. So how am I selective? Which one works well for what? Okay, so before we get to that, let me just sort of, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that Zynga is very famous for being very metric driven. All the squishy, squashy stuff we reduce to numbers, and we obsessively measure and monitor and tweak. And that's sort of one of the innovations that Mark Pincus and Zynga sort of brought to the social gaming and the gaming industry. So why should you really care? That's really the question some of you may be thinking. It's like, oh yeah, Yezi, that's great. You're at Zynga. You got infinite resources. You can afford to talk about all this stuff. I'm just 3-person team building a game. Well, it makes good business sense. So let me give you one example of a metric that we find correlates with how the game succeeds. That's related to community sentiment. And then we'll talk a little bit down the road about certain other examples. So there's something called Net Promoter Score in social gaming. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, not so many. All right. Let me just sort of give you the basic outline without the mathematics. Basically, it's something that was pioneered out of actually by Fred Reichfield, who wrote The Loyalty Effect, about the fact that it's much less expensive to keep a current customer loyal if you invest in that than try and acquire a new customer and lose the existing ones, right? So what Net Promoter Score really is, it's a measure of your customer loyalty and sentiment at any given time. It's basically a survey, and it measures sort of the percentage of your customer survey that would promote your game as it recommended to some of their friends versus those that are neutral or are detractors, which would absolutely say, no way in hell you should play this game. And it's important because it gives you sort of a pulse on your community. Now, like all surveys, it has to be statistically valid, it has to be sampled, but it's one metric that we do watch. Why is that important? Well, over time, as you watch NPS trends in games, if NPS starts falling, and we measure overall NPS, payer NPS, non-payer NPS, just because we're looking at different cohorts of our players, as NPS starts falling, we do see a trend where either you've got something wrong with your game, your CS ticket volumes are starting to rise, and it's an early warning system that players are going to start abandoning your game. Now, again, there's 1 billion people on Facebook, so, if you lost a few 100,000, what's the problem, right? Well, the problem is, again, as Trip mentioned in his keynote, and you've seen in some other talks, acquiring customers is increasingly more expensive. And worse than that, you can acquire them, retaining them is actually really expensive. So this is something that actually you need to pay attention to, because as you see this trend, you have to focus on what are the root causes, what are the key drivers of this, because you will start seeing either a spike in your CS volume or complaints on fan blogs, or people just walking away from your game. So it's something that we as a company care about, and it's not easy to move, just to be clear. There's no magic wand here, but if you don't pay attention to it, your game will die. The good news is, and we'll go through this with examples for the rest of the talk, is if you actually do keep your community happy, your player base happy, it actually generates not only greater engagement with your game, but greater revenue in multiple ways. And we'll go through different examples. So, you've got both a negative reason to focus on community, but more important, an upside you can drive with community as a partner if you choose to engage that way. Okay. So that's sort of the big picture. Now I'm going to drill down into different modes, best practices modes of interacting with your community with different tools. I'm going to zip through this because I want to make sure I get time for questions. And we can come back to this later. Most of the stuff should be pretty obvious, but I'll make a few points here and there with some case studies of games that we've actually done some of the stuff in, and then focus on the Farmville 2 case study explaining sort of how we wove community right through the launch of that game. So let's start with sort of basic engagement with your community. So the first thing you do is actually have a conversation. That's sort of, that's ground zero. If you're not talking to each other, you really don't have a community that you're engaged with. So let's start with that, right? So how do we do that? Well, each of our games has a forum, and some of them are very, very active in terms of traffic, questions, heat, and we have community moderators for these forums that are constantly monitoring them, responding to them, curating them, making sure there's no abuse on them, but more important, also notifying the studio of any hotspots, topics of discussion that are coming up consistently, or players are there's a big conversation brewing, and becomes our early warning system for our players who go there and tell us something's broken, or they give us their feedback on this new feature or this particular piece of content that we just released into the game. On these forums, basically, we use it as a way to sort of reach out to our, sort of touch our player base and sort of put our FAQs for games, for features, announce new things, even in certain cases, clear up misconceptions, because there's typically questions about how do I do X, or there's discussions, something ranging from some very prosaic stuff about how do I get this quest to complete with this part, etc., to sort of philosophical discussions, what's the future of social gaming and games like Mafia Wars or something like that. We like to engage, and this is sort of the first platform that we have to engage our community on. Next is social media. I'm sure all aware that there's been an explosion in possible channels. So we try and experiment with multiple channels, but sort of as a best practice, we have fan pages for each of our games, and we encourage our players to like these pages so that we can use them as a way to announce, to sort of create sort of content that they will be aware of first, run contests, etc. Sort of one of the things we've learned over the course of doing this multiple times is that you can encourage a lot more like participation on your Facebook page by sort of making it part of your sign up flow in terms of creating sort of a stepwise process to encourage players to do that. It becomes tremendously effective and cost effective to reach your player base this way, because all our players come through Facebook on bulk of our platforms. We also run per game blogs where both we sort of post content on a regular basis, but more important, we invite people from the studio to interact with players. So we have regular developer chats, talk to the developer, talk to the studio, where people participate. And again, we find that creating that interaction creates a sense that, you know, we are listening, we have a feel of the pulse of the community. And then finally, we actually, different games experiment with multiple additional social media channels. Most games do have a Twitter handle. We use Pinterest for sort of more broad-ranging branding, and we've been looking at Instagram too. So just a quick case study, sort of using Mafia Wars, sort of using our tools to engage the community. Mafia Wars is in the process of releasing probably one of its biggest fighting innovations in the last year, very, very shortly. And I don't know whether we announced it publicly, so I can't mention the name, but it will be coming out soon. So what we've been doing as a part of our pre-marketing on our blogs and our fan pages actually is creating a crossword game and dropping clues as to what this feature will do. And what we found is tremendous excitement and engagement from our community because they're buzzing about it, but they don't know exactly what it is. But the crossword clues give them an idea of what the feature might do or what it might be like. And so again, this is a way to create buzz very cheaply using social media channels. And so when you launch the feature, you know that your players are going to be wanting to try this out because they're already aware of it, they're talking about it, either on your blog or on their own fan blogs. So in addition to sort of some of the channels we talked about, there are other studio initiated channels. We send out email and fan blasts on a regular basis to notify people of upcoming events or features. We have in-game messaging at various parts in our game loop, including the preloader screen. That's the preloader screen from Cityville, for example, letting people know not only about things that are coming up or that have just been launched, but hints on how to play the game. And over time, we can personalize this stuff. So if you're stuck at a certain level or you're coming back after a month, we can do something interesting and give you a personalized hint as to how to proceed, for example, to make sure that you walk away happy from this play session. As well as doing in-game surveys. So in a lot of cases, we'd like to sort of get our most engaged players to tell us directly, when they get through a particular piece of content or a quest system or a new sort of feature, what they thought about it. And we can use that in a very tight feedback loop to update that feature or modify it or tweak the tuning. So all of these is stuff that all our games have built in, and we then analyze and sort of interact with this information. Something else, I mentioned we have a very passionate community in most of our games. And there's a lot of them don't believe that there's any reason they have to be a virtual community. So what we've done in the past with certain games is facilitate meetups between players across different locations, as well as with the studio. And what we found is there's a tremendous payback from this kind of activity. People want to interact with the developers making the game they love and play all the time. They want to meet other players across the world who they may have seen as Facebook users or on a Skype channel, actually in the flesh. And they want to discuss their passion and excitement with other players. So this is sort of pictures from a Mafia Wars meetup that in 2010. That world map there is actually the location of RSVPs for that meeting. So people from all over the world show interest in coming and meeting other players and meeting the studio. As I said, we have a global community, and it's pretty impressive to see that kind of passion for our games. Okay, the next one. So moving from a conversation, let's going something more like partnership. This has now become something that you have to invest more heavily in. Tending to a Facebook fan page or a Twitter handle or posting on a blog or answering questions on a forum, that takes a certain amount of investment and effort. But now you're talking about actually partnering and collaborating on your game roadmap. So the first sort of best practice that we've, I would say, implemented and sort of refined over multiple games and studios is something called a Player Advisory Council. And it sounds obvious, and obviously a lot of people do this, but how you do it is equally important. So the goal really is to engage your community, sort of bring the voice of the community into the studio design process, into the design loop, into our discussions and brainstorming around where the game goes next. So the way we set up a pack typically is we bring in a few members from our player community, and we typically do them from different levels of our player base. We try to get payers and non-payers to have a diversity of views. We try to get a combination of elder players and sort of mid-level players because we want people to represent different views. Typically what we also do is we explain that this is a privilege, not a right, so they don't expect any special favors from us in the game. As well as the flip side of this is we don't expect them to be continuously saying good things about us. If they disagree with something we're doing, they will go out to their blog and be vocal about it. And that's the risk you take in a pack, but the benefits are tremendous. We then commit to some of our studio resources to engage with the pack on a regular basis. So for example, the Mafia Wars pack has a monthly call with our pack members around the world where the studio is present. We present new features, we take their feedback. We also take their feedback on policy. For example, what happens if someone is using scripts? What should the policy of the studio be? Because there are people they know who are using that kind of thing on some of our games. And it's something we invest our community player advocacy resources too, because it's something you have to nurture and feed. It's not once a month meeting and you go back to your day-to-day work. We follow up. We participate in discussions with them. We create a private space. The most interesting thing is players want to be involved. Even the players who trash you sometimes because your feature wasn't up to what they thought it should be, they want to tell you how to improve the game that they play and love. So what we've done is actually created the pack, and then as a best practice, we rotate a set of our pack members every 6 months. We replace, say, 1/3 of them with new people who they can nominate. And so the idea is to keep new perspectives, fresh perspectives coming on a continuous basis. We found this to be tremendously successful. A lot of the features that have done really well in our games have come in primarily either through discussion with our pack in terms of refining them, in terms of making them sort of player delight friendly, or in terms of them telling us that this will never work and here's why, and sort of making us understand sort of how the community views certain things. And overall, I would say this is a huge benefit for a studio if you have the resources and the time to do this. It pays dividends in many, many ways. It also creates a serious connection with your player base. Explain to them that you're serious about sort of engaging with them. So as an example, again, I use Mafia Wars. One is it's one of our most popular games still, and it's got one of the most active vocal communities amongst all our games. So we have an elder player who calls herself Mafia Wars Loot Lady. Her name is Jen Patterson. She's got over 80,000 fans on Facebook. She is trusted by the entire player community. She is obsessive about our game. She knows she snoops our servers sometimes and knows about features we're about to release. We know about them before we actually release them, and she'll post it on her blog. She will deconstruct a new feature in terms of the tuning, explain how best to get through it. And and she's been a presence in the game and a big influence in the community. Now, when we started the pack, we debated, should we include Jen in this? Because on the one hand, she's got tremendous knowledge of the game, the history, as well as real, genuine care. But on the other hand, she's very strong-willed and very opinionated. And we decided we wanted to bring her into our conversation. And so we did that. And, we found her to be tremendously, what we found was when she understood our point of view and our constraints, she could represent us out to the community when people were posting stuff that was just unwarranted or incorrect. But at the same time, she has her independent voice. And on her blog, people still come for her opinion on a feature that we may have shown her as part of the pack, but she may not agree is the right way to do it. And we wouldn't have it any other way. So this is sort of the give and take of a player advisory council. You have strong, opinionated players, but they care about your game and they want to help you improve it. And like any partnership, sometimes partners disagree, but on the whole, it can be very, very successful if done well. Another case study of partnering with the community, Will, again, one of our sort of games, which is all about decorations and themes, where you sort of express your inner creativity, is entirely built around sort of this notion of themes and designs for accessories and outfits. We run a contest about 17 times a year with every new theme, whether it's Halloween, Christmas, you know, pick your festival or event, Chinese New Year, for example, and we provide themed outfits. But the most important part of this, we run a contest every time we launch a new theme for players to contribute their most interesting outfits. And the community judges the winners, and we then feature those as content in the game. The players get rewards and recognition in the game. They get, you know, social standing. And these outfits actually, because they're designed by players, actually sell really well. So interestingly enough, you've got players partnering with you to improve your game and helping you make money. And finally, let's talk about sort of the extreme of collaboration, which is proactive collaboration or adaptation. So again, I'm using an example from Mafia Wars, which is something that's just fascinating that happened 2 years ago. So this is not recent, but I'll show you the impact it's had over the last 2 years. So in about 2010, beginning of 2010, right? One of the things that the studio recognized was a lot of the players playing Mafia Wars were sort of organizing outside of the game into something they call families or clans, sort of like the Godfather, right? And it's actually interesting. It was 300,000, 400,000 when we actually first discovered this phenomenon, 300,000 families plus. And there were all kinds of sizes and organizations. Some were democratic, some had a patriarch, some were, you know, had a parliamentary system for getting stuff done. And they were using a variety of channels, Yahoo Messenger, Skype, to coordinate and make sure that, you know, for example, everyone in my family is going to fight those guys because they beat us up last. It's fascinating. And we had nothing in the game to actually support this. So we said, wow, you know, we're starting to see this. It looks like this is not a sort of flash in the pan. Let's figure out how to deal with it, how to engage with it and improve the game through it. So we actually went out and started talking to these players saying, why are you doing this? Is, you know, why is the family construct so important to you? And a lot of cases, it's a way for sort of weaker players to band together and achieve more goals or level up together. It's a way to sort of even, in some cases, sit on a player or a set of players that are rivals to you in the game, or in some cases take revenge if someone's been beating you up and get protection of a larger group. This is a trend that, you know, we saw accelerating. We started talking to them about sort of how we could use this organization that was happening completely outside the game, in the game, and they started talking to us about how to take our existing features, our robbing system, our fighting system, our property building system, and how to, you know, make them sort of family-oriented features in the sense of, no pun intended. So what do, right? Over the course of the last 2 years, most of our features now have a family version. So you can have family battles, or you can fight 1 versus 1. You have family properties where the family together can contribute to building sort of a new property that you craft and then get loot drops from. You have family progression based on number of ices or kills you do in the game that helps your family level up. But here's the interesting thing. In the last 2 years now, the majority of our revenue comes from players who are in families. So from 2 years ago, when this thing didn't exist in the game, watching this, adapting to it, actually changing our roadmap, listening to your community, and these players, by the way, are the most loyal and most engaged because their family is there. So there's that social pressure to stay and play in the game. It's amazing, right? Since I'm running short on time, I'm going to just go through the last part of the talk, and then I'll take questions. So we've talked sort of about community in the macro sense and, you know, digging down to terms of tools and best practices. Let's pull it together and sort of go through a specific case study. Farmville 2, our latest blockbuster, released about 2 months ago, and it's already over 50 million users in terms of installs and MAU. I want to talk about how community was critical to the conceptualization, the launch, and the post-launch process. So right from the beginning, we were quite aware that we wanted sort of community to sort of be a partner right through the game development process. pre-launch integrated into the game, and I'll explain that. While we were launching as a beta, sort of a soft launch, and so taking that early feedback to refine the game before we open it up across our network of players. And then post-launch, when we actually turned on our cross-promotion pipeline and how that continues to sort of drive engagement, drive monetization. So let's talk about pre-launch. So one of the first things that we did this time when we were launching Farmville 2 was community was actively involved in the conceptualization process of the game. They were involved in every spec review for every feature that we launched, as well as the fact that we integrated various touch points around the game board in the game to reach out to community right from the beginning. It was not an afterthought, as sometimes it tends to be in a lot of cases. Oh, I'm out of time. Can I have 2 minutes? Yes, sir. Okay. In addition to that, one of the things that we did was we invested very heavily in making sure that every piece of art, every asset we built was community friendly. So it could be sized to go out on our Facebook page, it could go out on our Twitter handle, so that everything that was done with making sure community could engage, participate in mind. In addition, what we did was we started early polling the community with this concept and understanding what kinds of features they would like in a game like Farmville 2. So those baby animals at the bottom, they actually came from surveys of Farmville users from the first game and other similar games. And they told us that, you know, you guys don't have enough baby animals in what you're telling me you're planning to build. We put those in. They're now one of the highest sellers in our virtual goods store. So again, this is pre-launch at this point. Then we went into early beta, and again, because of the scale of our player base and because Farmville is a beloved title, we wanted to make sure we did this in a controlled way. So we launched as Big Harvest. We geo-locked it to Indonesian users because that's a country that is sort of representative of some of our player base, and also English speaking. And we also went out when this was geo-locked and started polling the early players and saying, what do you like? What's working for you? What's not? The first thing that came back was, we don't understand why you're calling it Big Harvest. It's Farmville 2. So we changed the name. The second thing that came back in some cases was for certain regions of the world, you know, we had a lot of cute little pigs running around the farm. Well, for a lot of regions, that's not actually something that they find that offensive. So we removed that because our audience for this game is a lot more international than for Farmville 1. So if you notice, there are no pigs in Farmville 2. But that comes through a direct interaction with the community as you're going through the playtest. At the same time, one of the things you do when you're doing this is you find really passionate players who are just, you know, want to tell you how to fix the game before it's launched. So this guy, Sean, was joined in May in our beta, and he basically said that your crafting system is completely broken. You know, you guys don't have a good FAQ, people don't know how to combine stuff. So he took it on himself, he enlisted players in the beta, he created an entire crafting directory that's become now part of our user education sort of arsenal, as well as sort of came in 5 times a day. I'm sorry, he's come into the game about 300 times since we launched, just to make sure that he can give feedback or sort of improve the game. Someone really dedicated. What we did was that we took what he had built and we amplified it, making it part of the game. So again, this is someone now who's become one of your loyal players, but also an amplifier of sort of a very big stake in the success of your game within your community. And finally, after launch, one of the things that we're lucky to have across our network is we have a lot of players. We turned on our cross-promotion engine, and so 290 million of our players across our network got an invitation to play Farmville 2 when we were ready. And this game has been localized into multiple languages. Our community pages are localized into 5 languages at launch because it's one of our biggest launches this year. 290 million players got the invitation, and they got an inducement in the game they actually play and enjoy to go just try it out. And quite a number of them did, and they love it. And so now they're playing the game that they saw the invitation in, as well as Farmville 2. And interestingly enough, players discovered Easter eggs. So for example, in Farmville 2, when you level up, you have, with some probability, there's a player that comes and does a dance on the farm. So someone took that and created a parody Gangnam Style video. Didn't get as many hits as the original one, as you can see. But we liked the idea so much, we took that and we put it back into the game. So on Farmville 2, if you level up, with some probability, one of the 3 NPCs who comes and dances will be a Gangnam Style character created by one of our fans. Okay? Again, amazing, and something that we love to do because it really sort of engages them. So what are the results of all this, right? These are actually headlines from the business press. Farmville 2 has just been a stunning hit, both in terms of retention and monetization and user growth. And a large part of that is because we wolfed the community participation right from the beginning. At every touch point, we were working with them to make sure we were incorporating their points of view and their thoughts. And that's the result. So anyway, I'm over time, so thank you for your patience. I don't know if I have time for questions, so. Yeah, no. Do I have time? 2, 3 questions. All right, yes. I think a gentleman there someone had his hand up. By the way,